Okay, I want to introduce you to Dr. Catherine Kerr. She is the Director of Translational Neuroscience at the Contemplative Studies Initiative at Brown University. Now just think about how many interdisciplinary terms are in that title. And you'll get an image of Catherine, who is, as she writes in her biography, one of the few individuals who has simultaneously published, if not at the same month, within a short span of time in qualitative humanities journals and top neuroscience journals. She is actually had a formative role in creating the kind of informal community among researchers that has taken notice of the hype of the science. And it's around Kathy and her Facebook groups and the manuscript that I put up before about prescriptives for issues of hype about science.
So you also organized this conference.
She's a co-organizer of this conference.
You organized this conference.
I'm a co-organizer.
You're a co-organizer.
I'm a tertiary organizer. You're a troublemaker, Dave.
Loving critic.
All right, so thanks a lot. This is great. I'm really happy to be here. I wasn't sure that I was going to come, and then I decided to. And I think everything. This has been a wonderful meeting, and I've learned a lot. So thank you. So the title of my talk is "Taking Neural Data Off of Its Pedestal and a Plea for Pragmatism," and I'm going to talk about the gap between what people experience when they are participants in a scientific study of meditation and what our brain scans show us happens as a result of that experience. And I'm going to introduce a category that I'm going to call experience-near research. So in order to do this, before I talk about mindfulness, I'm going to talk about some of my prior work on the placebo effect and pain. So basically, people come up to you and they say, what is mindfulness? Should I practice mindfulness? And I want to reframe how we might answer these questions in light of pain research, medical anthropology, and placebo research. And the takeaways that I'm going to leave you with today are that brain imaging studies tell us very little about individuals' subjective experiences. Clinical trials tell us very little about individuals' subjective experiences. The thing that tells us about individuals' subjective experiences is asking people about their subjective experience. Okay. So to answer the question, what is mindfulness? Should I practice mindfulness? You might ask someone to reflect on, what is it like for me to practice mindfulness? What did I think about that experience? That reflecting on experience and starting that way, I think can be really productive. So I'm calling this a pragmatist framing of mindfulness. This is a picture of our 2010 mindfulness gathering, and where I propose that mindfulness is what people experience when they do mindfulness practice. It sounds sort of circular and evasive, but I'm going to show you using some other examples why it might be helpful. So the point here is that I want to put practice first rather than a theoretical top-down definition. And I want to describe a more general approach, this is sort of a kind of rough pragmatism. So we can see how the basic problem here is that we put out a noun like mindfulness, and even we think we know what we're talking about, and we don't. We put out these abstractions. We think that we understand what we're saying, but we don't. That's the sort of our basic dilemma. And we can see this process, how this process of labeling and abstraction can lead us astray, especially in the problem of pain. So here's how most of us might think about back pain. Back pain, I'm going to talk about the problem of abstraction and pain. Back pain is caused by bulging discs. This is a very appealing theory. It makes complete sense, doesn't it? Okay. Here's a picture of a young woman with a bulging disc. She's in her early 20s. She has a diagnostically positive MRI, as did 52% of the people in this New England Journal of Medicine study. None of them had any back pain. They weren't back pain patients. They were healthy people recruited off the street. And their scans, their imaging scans of their bulging discs had absolutely no relationship with their subjective experiences. So it's a really interesting and extreme example that's hard for a lot of people to absorb. In many, many contexts, imaging conveys no additional information about subjective states. So, because I get calls all the time, my colleague Sarah Lazar gets calls all the time. I want to grow my brain. So what practice should I do? And it's so hard to explain to people why we think that's the wrong question to be asking. So imaging usually conveys no additional information about subjective states, and it actually often does a poor job rendering disease states. So there seems to be a dissociation between imaging and our abstract theory and what's really going on with back pain. And how do we make sense of this? For 300 years, we had the nociceptive theory of pain, which is that pain is the result of irritated nerve fibers and actual tissue damage in the body. This dates back to Descartes. This incredibly pristine abstract logic. It makes complete sense. Pain is the result of tissue damage. It just happens to be wrong. Beautiful theories can be wrong. So now we know there's something called the gate control theory of pain from the 1960s, which says that pain can originate in the central nervous system. It's not a reflection of local tissue damage. Here's the current definition of pain in the clinical pain and in the IASP research group. Pain is an unpleasant sensory emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage or described in terms of such damage. This is an experiential category. Pain in this reframing is what pain patients say it is. Okay? Talking to pain patients is how we learned how to redefine pain. This was a bottom-up type of move. This was not a sort of top-down, highly theoretical imposition. And we could talk more about pain. Pain clinicians have known for several decades that imaging doesn't tell you about pain, but people still come in, they want their backs scanned. Even very well-educated members of the public with high scientific literacy do not seem to get this. Why is this? And it's because the beautiful biological images take us in. Okay? It happens to all of us. It's very, very difficult not to be seduced by these images. Pain is the ultimate subjective experience. We think we know what that means, but we don't. And I hope this story will give us some humility and make us less quick to reach into our handy bag of abstractions. So takeaway number one, imaging and subjective experience are not necessarily related. They're really not related. There's all sorts of problems with fMRI that I don't want to go into. You can read about it in The Guardian. They imaged a dead salmon, and all of these findings came out, and all the statistics are weak, and blah, blah, blah. Okay, it's very easy to be seduced by beautiful theories. So I'm going to just give you really quickly an example of what I mean when I'm talking about listening to people's experience. This is a picture of my first mentor, Ted Kapchuk from Harvard Medical School. He's a very interesting figure. He trained as an acupuncturist. He had no other degrees, the first person to become a full professor at Harvard Medical School without any degrees. And he's one of the leading explorers of the placebo effect. And he came into this field, and he invited me to work with him. And there were a lot of lazy, misleading abstractions about the placebo effect. Placebo responders have certain personalities. Oh yeah, of course. They're neurotic. The only people who respond are people who start out as believers, okay? Now, there are some kind of very weak associations here, but it does not really explain the placebo effect at all. So it turns out nobody had really studied prospectively in a large clinical trial what does the placebo effect look like when you compare different forms of placebo. We were the first to do that, and we found a really robust response. But the thing, and that's this bar figure here. So this is actually the same amount of efficacy as you would see in a drug trial. But look at this. If you look at the individual responses, It turns out that this very robust clinical trial response actually tells you almost nothing about individual responses. You'll notice that many people in the group that did the best actually did not do that well. And several people in the worst group did quite well. What's the point here? The point is that these articles about large clinical trials don't tell us anything about individual responses. They don't, if somebody comes up to you and they say, on average, maybe you'll do a little better if you do this than do that. That's what those studies tell us. That's it. So people put way too much weight on these results. Results of studies, this is takeaway number 3, results of studies done in populations tell us very little about the experience of any single individual. So think again, this person has come up to you and they said, what is this mindfulness? Should I practice mindfulness? I've been reading about the science in the newspaper. This is what I would tell them, okay? I mean, what's it going to do with my brain? Okay? So the problem, an alluring theory, and in placebo research there were a bunch of alluring theories, and one of the main things that these alluring theories were trying to do was to black box the placebo response. And what do I mean by that? So basically, it's say, okay, we're going to measure pre, we're going to measure post, and inside the clinical trial, we don't care what happens. It's a black box, okay? Just whatever. Well, we started thinking about this, and we were also working with someone named Arthur Kleinman, who does medical anthropology research. And he has this whole idea that actually the stuff that takes place in the middle of a clinical trial is really dynamic and important. There's a lot of experiences there, a lot of fluctuations. So that instead of it looking like a black box, it might look something like this. And then you want to know, like, what the heck happened in that dip? What were the experiences that people were undergoing? And it starts to make you realize that there's a lot of these, what Evan called looping effects, that are taking place in the middle of these studies. So what we did was we embedded a qualitative study within our large 270-person NIH-funded clinical trial. And we actually, it was a pretty ambitious, scaled-up qualitative study with 3 qualitative researchers. And it was, as far as I know, the first qualitative study within a quantitative RCT to be funded by the NIH. And we found that a lot of what I talked about, those lazy assumptions in the placebo effect, seemed to be wrong. So these are some of the papers that we published. We found that rather than people having, that the believers got better, the people who expected to get better got better, we found that in our IBS placebo effect trial, no one expected to get better, which is really, really interesting. They hoped they would get better, but they didn't expect to get better. It's a very interesting difference. The other thing we found was that their hopes fluctuated a lot in the middle of the study. Like there would be little events in their experience that would cause all sorts of fluctuation. The other thing we found that was that people experienced really complex, this is a IBS study, so it's irritable bowel syndrome, so it's a somatic condition. People experience really complex somatic sensations when receiving placebo treatment. So how did we do these interviews? We asked people really open-ended questions. What do you think will happen to you in the clinical trial? Then people would sort of go on. We'd ask them some semi-structured probes, like, what do you think will happen then? We did follow-ups, but it was extremely open-ended, and we really allowed the patients' voices to emerge, or that was our goal, certainly. We didn't want to impose and obviously I'm not making an argument that we were free of bias, but we really wanted to hear just what people would say if we asked them these really simple questions. We also asked them, what did treatment feel like? What was that like? So just sort of kind of eliciting some of these sort of very simple things got some very interesting responses. And as I mentioned, our approach was derived from medical anthropology. Arthur Kleinman has this approach of doing an illness narrative. Tell me the story of your illness. Tell me what this has been like for you. Really, really simple questions. And this is what they call experience near data collection. So I think this is a question of the specificity of experience. what do people who enter studies or enter programs really experience? And this is, I'm going to be a little tendentious. This is not an ideological reading of some moments in a teacher's manual, which is the evidence that I've seen in these what is mindfulness debates. Just very ideological, rhetorical statements that I don't think are particularly helpful when you think about the actual human beings that are doing these practices. Okay, so I'll have a couple more of those statements. Okay. So I think being interested in this dynamic therapeutic process is really important, and figuring out ways to let people sort of talk about their experience in their own words is also really important. So how did we apply this to mindfulness? So I was a placebo researcher until 2006, and then I got an NIHK award to retrain as a neuroscientist to do somatosensory cortical dynamics, which was new to me. And so I have a beautiful theory that I believe. In fact, I know that it's true. But I'll spare you that. So my beautiful theory has to do with how contemplative practices repattern brain-body interaction and how they change the way that brain representations of the body work, basically. And so there's a very strong emphasis on embodiment in my science. So I looked at primary somatosensory cortex, and could mindfulness training, could we see whether people could retrain the dynamics in their finger map in primary somatosensory cortex using attention. And it was a very small study, it was a pilot study, and we got a positive finding. So I could go on at length, but I'm on YouTube, so you can see that. So at the same time, this was a K award, so it wasn't highly funded, so we weren't able to do an elaborate interview study, but we were able to capture people's experience by looking at their practice diaries. So all we did was we just asked people to write down any notable aspects of practice for each of their days of practice. And so we got 6 participants that just gave us daily diary entries, and they averaged about 4 to 5 practices a week for 8 weeks of MBSR. And we found some interesting stuff. We found that there was a lot of somatic, attentional sort of experience reports, starting very early in the first week. Somebody says abdominal discomfort, tension on left side of torso. That was her notable experience. So I thought that was kind of interesting. We had somebody who wasn't familiar with the hypotheses of the study, code things, and so she pulled that out. The second thing we found was that there was a lot of distress in the 4th, 5th, and 6th weeks of the study. People went through a period of distress, and that was surprising to me. I did not know that that was going to happen. It seemed slightly existential. Feeling insecure, desire to move, quit, and move to the Bahamas, desire for it to end, I hated it. And then people sort of settle into a more positive trajectory. So, we learned something a little bit surprising, what I'm going to say here is that this experience near data sort of informed our theorizing. So these would be our findings. The somatic attention reports began in the first week. There was ubiquitous distress in weeks 4 and 5. Later recovery involving less reactivity, which is, all of that's kind of interesting. And it suggests 2 mechanisms. There's this immediate somatic attentional mechanism, and there's this longer-term existential reorientation mechanism. This is my sort of gloss on what we found. And my beautiful theory would suggest that there's an immediate change in primary somatosensory cortex, and then maybe there is another change that happens later over a longer period of time, which is change in the bodily self. There's a representation of the bodily self in the posterior parietal cortex. So everybody, if you just go like this, go. How do you know that that's you, that you own that body? What if this was someone else, right? Well, there's an area in the brain that actually seems to encode this sort of bodily self-ownership, whatever that is. And, but it gets a lot of information from these early sensory areas, and there may be some transformative process that takes place as people go through the course of the trial. So that's my beautiful theory. There's really no evidence for it, and I'm only kind of saying it because I want to relate to the brain, but I don't want to leave you with that. Here's the moment of caution, right? Because I love my theory. What about all that stuff that I just said about contingency and the emergence of experience and therapeutic process during the trial? And here's where I want to leave you, which is beware the beautiful theory. Be careful about the beautiful theory, okay? And see if you can listen in an open-ended way to what people are really saying about their experience. And hold in mind that imaging and subjective experience are not related. They're not necessarily related. It's very easy to be seduced by beautiful theories. The results of studies done in populations tell us very little about the experience of any single individual. And the takeaway is to be focused on meaning. Focus on experiences that are taking place right in front of us that may be more dynamic and interesting than we've previously thought. And reframe your question so it considers experience in addition to your a priori definition of your subject. And if you're running a mindfulness study, capture some of this qualitative, don't want to say hypothesis-free, but less sort of intensely hypothesis-driven experience in your data from diaries and open-ended questions. You know, for 100 years, psychologists have dismissed experience near data as weak introspectionism. In the meantime, though, we become enmeshed in irresolvable ideological, ontological questions. Does mindfulness give us access to true original consciousness or mind? This seems like an irresolvable and uninteresting question to me. What we do know is that mindfulness-based practices change people's experiences, and that on average, in some situations, they seem to be helpful. Those things are true, rather than these kind of, you know, other sort of more abstract questions. Sorry, Evan. Medical anthropology is helpful here. Anthropologists study healing rituals. They don't ask about the reality of ghosts. They ask, what do the rituals do? What do the participants experience? That's what we should care about. And we're going to do that, actually. I'm switching from, I'm going to switch to something that people call energy, whatever that is. Ooh. Energy may be related to what people directly report about their experiences while undergoing energy-related practices, such as Qigong. And notice, I'm not asking, does energy exist? We're going to do a large study of Qigong and breast cancer, and we're going to do a lot of mechanisms. I'm not asking, does energy exist? I'm asking, what does the experience of doing a so-called energy-related therapy feel like? And that's a really different question. So I'm suggesting a move away from the ontological towards the pragmatic. And I want to thank all the people who helped me on these studies. And this was an NIH-funded, my study was an NIH-funded study, and my ability to be here today is thanks to the Landis Berkman Family Fund. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Do I call on people or do you?
Would you like to?
Yeah, go ahead.
So you do.
Okay.
So thank you. That was wonderful. And I particularly like the way that you're problematizing the relationship between the body or the brain and experience. Where I'm confused, and you don't want to, where I'm confused is that you don't seem to want to problematize in precisely the same way the relationship between subjective report and experience.
I recognize that there is a gap between those two things, but I see it as an insuperable gap that doesn't interest me because it's unsolvable.
I suspected you would respond in that way. But there are two possible responses to your response, one of which is you're creating a black box which is very much akin to the black box that you want to do away with. It's just deferring it, and it may come back to haunt you later on. And the other way is I would agree that it's an insuperable gap, but it has to do with the fact that it's not that the gap is insuperable, but there's something profoundly wrong with the way we are thinking about what is happening.
I
as
agree
it
with
were.
you completely. Like, we make this into a problem. I think what you're saying is that we make this into this very large ontological problem when really there's something else going on.
Yeah, except where I would want to go on this is to get rid of the latent Cartesianism. That you've taken one step there, but you don't want to go to the final step because it sounds like a kind of behaviorism that's scary, which is to say what we're dealing with are interactive reports. We're not actually dealing with experiences.
I could say that, but they have a source in a person's voice. My voice is a little different from yours. I mean, as long as we agree on that. Okay. Interesting. Thanks.
I'll be your runner.
Okay. Well, no one wants to talk. Cliff, can you just call on people? I don't know what to do.
So I want to follow up on that. It seems that the relationship between an experience and what comes out of somebody's mouth is no more tight than the relationship between their experience and some pattern of brain activity. After all, what's coming out of your mouth is coming out because of activity in your motor cortex, right?
Right.
So I don't see any reason why that's more directly related. Now, the reality is that
Well, I have an answer to that, but go
our
ahead.
measures of brain activity are really pretty coarse. And so our current measures often might not have the fidelity to, I can't, by looking at an MRI scan of your brain, tell exactly what sequence of words you're saying, right? So it may be that the verbal report somebody gives has a lot higher bandwidth. But there's also a lot more stages of interpretation and bias and stuff between the experience in somebody's report than there might be in some cases between a sophisticated measure of brain activity and the
So here's my
experience.
answer to your question, and I think it's because ultimately I'm a clinical researcher, which is in a situation like pain, the thing that we care about is the person in pain. That's what we care about. I mean, all of this other imaging is interesting, but at the end of the day, that's the suffering dimension that we care about. And fine, if it's a little bit, that we're not getting, there's some bias that's coming out in the encounter and all of that that's happening, but we still have that as our goal. That to me, the ultimate goal is to understand and help the person.
So if you
And
have sort of
if brains
extreme
can't-
cases, right?
Yeah.
So you're not seeing people who have a little bit of pain and it's not a big deal. But if we're talking about mindfulness, the effects might be really pretty subtle.
Right.
And I can tell you, I have a 15-year-old daughter who sometimes reports having some pain and she wants to stay home from school.
Right.
Right? And there's a whole lot of bias in that self-report. And if I had the right neural measure, I might be able to make a better judgment about whether she should go to school
That is
or
a
not.
really, really interesting discussion, and it's something that we're going to see in the legal system. That we are seeing in the legal system right now, which is, are people shamming in pain, and can fMRIs be used to answer that question? And I think, there's a lot of ethical issues around that, and it's very complex. And I agree with you that a statement that I'm in pain has a lot of complexity in it. And I guess that's what I wanted us to take into account, which is that I am in pain is a multidimensional statement. It's not exactly what we think it is. There may be some social aspects to it or whatever reasons. But our job is to try to understand that, I think.
Very nice talk, thank you. Similar to what you were talking about with pain, as you know, pain is very difficult to study because of differences between people, including idiosyncratic ways of experiencing pain and expectations in terms of what the interviewer might be wanting to hear, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the sort of traditional ways of addressing some of these problems is to try to get rid of the between participant differences by looking at differences over time within the same person. and trying to relate various factors to those fluctuations in pain. And I wonder whether that could be considered to be a potentially useful approach as well when looking at some of these other issues related to the mindfulness. In other words, looking at individual people over time. And,
oh yeah, definitely. I think looking at change over time and the dynamics of change over time, it could be very, very helpful. I have more to say about pain and experimental pain approaches, but I think I actually want us to get back to the mindfulness. But maybe I'll take that up in the break. John, did you have a question?
I did.
You get the last word. We got to move on.
Well, I just thought, since you seem to be endorsing a fully eliminativist project coming from Bob, which is that there really is no such thing as experience, there are just verbal reports, a la Dennett, which is what Bob thinks. Of course not. No, of course not. Okay, okay. But what I'm curious is, are you interested in the notion that actually there is some there, and that we can work with sort of just open-ended verbal reports, but also do you think it would be useful to try to develop methods that inquire more deeply into the phenomenology of, whether it's the phenomenology of mindfulness or pain or what have you? Is that a viable project on your point?
Yes, it is. And I'm not endorsing an eliminativist approach. I'm saying that subjectivity needs to be loosely held and not grasped on too tightly. And sometimes that eliminativism will seem like the most true thing, but maybe not in every context. And Judd led a study where we did some neurophenomenology in the scanner that was quite interesting. And I think there's a lot more to be done there. And we have an alternative method to the elicitation method that we're sort of interested in. So I do think that that's very productive, but I think it is sort of, the most important thing is for us to bear these cautions in mind about our beautiful theories, and to understand that these qualitative methods are not, they're extremely subjective and not free of bias, and to somehow be okay with that on some level, and just try to be as conscientious as we can in the situation that we have.
So I lied. I'm going to ask the last question. You showed a graph of the individual differences from the RCT.
Oh, yeah.
Is there a graph in your mind of individual differences in the veracity of self-report?
I hadn't thought of that, huh?
Whether or not some individuals, to the extent there may be external signs, are in fact exquisitely accurate, and other individuals, it's much spongier.
It's really interesting. There are ways to get at those problems by looking at sentence structure and the complexity of sentence structure and how nouns are used and stuff like that. I'm not an expert in any of that, but I actually think that those are tractable questions. And that how semantics change over time can, like the way that someone expresses stuff about their experience could tell us a lot about where they fall out on that plot.
So is there a role for art as self-report?
Oh, that's a beautiful question. I want to say yes, but I don't have a strong vision of how that would work. Thanks.
Could I just try to wrap something up in a way that I think everybody might be happy with? Just to try it.
What is happening?
That the issue is not, it's not that subjectivity isn't there. It's that it cannot be disambiguated, either practically or theoretically, from interior narrative or verbal self-report. Is that something that even John could live with?
Not quite.
Okay, I like that, but I think under most circumstances, I would be open to the possibility that under certain interesting or surprising circumstances, I wouldn't rule that out a priori. Thanks. Thank you.